Silence, roll 10. Did you have any repercussions come from that scene in Way when you tried to film the surrender of white flag?
There were repercussions. There were repercussions, not immediate. The American Marines realized shortly afterwards that I'd been there and that I'd recorded a tape, which was the most damning evidence rather than the film, actually. I had passed on the transcript of that tape to 2 or 3 American journalists who wrote the story. The American military then hounded me for about the next 12 months. First of all, to get back that tape, and then indeed to have me expelled from the country. But the Vietnamese weren't going to have any of that. It wasn't their view of the argument at all, quite the opposite. The Americans did momentarily take away my American military accreditation, which only meant that I couldn't cover the Americans. I couldn't travel on their very comprehensive transport system. But it didn't worry me too much, because after all I did cover the Vietnamese side of the war much more than the Americans. Eventually I was let off the hook, as you might say, because about a year later the My Lai massacre, Lieutenant Kelly's infamous massacre in a village in the northern part of South Vietnam, came to light, and the fact of shooting down one man with a white flag was lost and became no more important than just another small facet.
That film, did that ever see the TV screens back in Australia or England?
No, I don't believe it ever did. The outlook in my office, that is the Visnews office in London, was that, oh, throw up our hands in horror, it's a little bit controversial. We really don't want to get into that realm. And so it never was shown. There may have been a cut from the film, but certainly the sound recording, the tape, was never used. And it wasn't explained exactly what was happening. That happened quite a lot, not with me, but the way a story was presented was very much up to either the cameraman or the correspondent, or a combination of both. I think maybe we better cut. Sorry, Mr. Kim.
Roll 10, slate 2. What was the difference between the way your film was edited and, say, a correspondent cameraman team who run the networks?
The difference in the finished product between the film I would shoot and the film, for instance, an American network or an Australian network or a European network for that matter would cover, was that the correspondent working on the story with the American network influenced to a great extent the final editing of the film, because his script put forward a certain line. For instance, the line might be that the South Vietnamese soldiers are no good and that's why they lost this battle. Whereupon I may have covered the same story, but I would have covered a much broader picture with more detail into why the Vietnamese lost that battle, which may not have been their fault. It may have been lack of support, which the Americans didn't give them, for instance. So, in the final analysis, as Visnews in London were under no obligation to present a certain line, they presented what was, to their way of thinking, a fairly well-balanced story. The same story covered by an individual network only presented the opinion of the correspondent on the spot. And that was a very dangerous way to cover, as far as I could see.
Would your cut version, had you been given a chance to influence it, been different to the way Visnews cut it?
Inevitably, I think I would have cut my own film in a different manner to the way it was cut in London by Visnews, but not so much as it would be if I was working for an American network, and that was one reason why I didn't care to work for an American network. During the Vietnam War I did have offers of jobs, but I didn't want to be subject to that control by both the network and the correspondent on the job. Visnews, I believe, didn't cut my film with enough feeling or with enough background information either. But it was certainly better than working for an American network or any other network controlled just by one or two people.
Why would the American networks cut it differently?
Because when you present a story with a correspondent on the job, he sees it in a certain manner, and quite often, particularly with the Americans, he wants it to be sensational so that it furthers his career. You don't further your career in American television by telling a well-balanced story, not generally anyway. You look for the sensational aspect of a certain story and concentrate on that. It may not be totally wrong, but it certainly isn't exactly right either, because you haven't balanced it by giving certain reasons. If you just say the South Vietnamese unit filmed here were absolutely smashed to pieces, defeated by the Viet Cong, well then I think you should say why they were defeated. But the inference quite often for a long time during the Vietnam War was that they were defeated because they simply weren't good enough.
If you had have worked for the Americans, would the money have been much better?
Oh yes, the money would, if I'd worked for the Americans, the money would have been much, much better, maybe double.
And is there finally a contradiction, or at least a compromise on your part then, if you did end up working for the Americans?
Well, I started to work for the Americans after the Indochina War ended, that's one thing. And I work for NBC News in America now, but still as an individual. I am my own cameraman and my own correspondent. We came to that agreement, and I'm the only cameraman correspondent, as far as I know, in the world working for the Americans. I'm grateful to NBC News for that, and I think it's a step forward. It's not necessary for every camera team in the world to be one man, but it's a good thing to have at least some flexibility in that way.
But you did leave Visnews, and your final footage in Saigon, for instance, was shot for the Americans.
Yes, I shot the fall of Saigon for the Americans under contract. I was still working very much on my own there. I was working with an American correspondent, but he was working freelance too, and he had lived a long time in Vietnam, and he wanted to tell a good, well-balanced story, and I believe he did. So under those conditions, I agreed to stay on and work for the Americans.
But the final version of the fall of Saigon wasn't exactly how you wanted it. It was cut.
I was disappointed in the final version of the film that depicted the fall of Saigon. I think that was mainly because it didn't show enough of what went on. There was a lot of studio stuff in America. A lot of people still wanted to be involved in the Vietnam War. They were still thinking about their careers. I wasn't satisfied, but then it wasn't a bad job.
Did you think that anything and everything was legitimate to film?
I can't think of many exceptions, but there were some. I didn't feel that dwelling on the great personal grief and misfortune of people, civilians or soldiers, was of was something that I should continue to do. But you have to show some of those aspects to show a well-balanced story. It's just that I didn't concentrate continually on those aspects which were the misfortune of the people involved.
Would you balk at filming anything at all?
I don't know that I would balk at filming, yeah.